Okay, welcome everybody to this week's Spectrum Cast for Data Resilience. Again, joined by my co-host, Randy Arsenault, and as always, Tricia Jang and Sean Sperry. Thanks, guys, for being with us. So last week, Randy brought up a very interesting in the news story around GDPR. And it got us to thinking a little bit about data protection, data resilience, compliance, archiving, et cetera. So maybe we thought we would talk a little bit about some of these topics. So IBM has two capabilities, probably has more, but two capabilities in our data protection portfolio: Spectrum Archive and Spectrum Protect for long-term retention. Sean, you want to start and tell us a little bit about Spectrum Archive?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, just to kind of start off, it's one of those things that I always chuckle when I get asked about one of these products, because I have to look at the name and kind of try and figure out, well, what in the world does this product or this thing do? Because archive in terms of backup and data can have so many different meanings to so many different people that you often have to go out and kind of look at the specific technology and the specific use cases to figure out what in the world the product does and what it really means. Spectrum Archive is a tool that allows you to write to tape and has a graphical user interface so that you can go out and get to the data, retrieve the data, and store it for, here I'm going to use another buzzword, right? Long-term retention, right? But my take on Spectrum Archive is it's one of those tools that's used for use cases where you have a very large amount of data that you want to store at a very reasonable price and keep it for a very long time. And of course, tape is one of those technologies that you use to that. So I've heard of it being used for things like video, movie catalogs, things along those lines.
Great.
Yeah, and any kind of large, it also comes back to tape, doesn't it? Like we always end up talking about tape, which is awesome because I'm a tape fan. I think we all are. And the reason why linear media will never die, because as data volumes continue to explode and increase geometrically, there is no more cost-effective. Yeah, there is no more cost-effective medium for storing huge volumes of data for long periods of time.
Yeah.
And Tricia, could you talk to us a little bit about the Spectrum Protect for long-term retention?
Yeah, well, first of all, building on what Sean said, archive is such a vague word that I agree. Not only do you have to look at the product, but you have to look at what you mean. And so looking at the Spectrum Protect portfolio, we talk about archive. First of all, inside of Spectrum Protect, traditionally we've had backup, which is version-based in our policies. And then we had archive, which was time-based. So how long do I need to keep something? Like a tax file needs to be kept for 7 years. And then we had space management, which is also sometimes called archive, which is taking those large files like the movie files or the geodata files and just replacing them with a stub file and moving that file out to disk or tape or something that's cheaper. So when I'm talking about archive, I'm talking about keeping something for a specific amount of time. And so the first piece inside of Spectrum Protect is the ability to set in our policy and specifically archive a file for a specific time. And then we recently introduced retention sets, which, back to Sean's point, this is a retention piece where we can take a backed up file and turn it into a file that's being retained for a specific amount of time, like an archive. So that's another built-in piece inside of Spectrum Protect. We then have a product called Space Management, which does the movement, replacing on the production machine the files with the smaller stub file, and that's an add-on product to Spectrum Protect. Or we have something called Spectrum Protect for data retention, which is a dedicated Spectrum Protect server where you've set a code when you install the server, and it is specifically for archive purposes. So you have like a content management product feeding those files to the Spectrum Protect for data retention. It used to also be called SSAM, System Storage Archive Manager. And these files are then kept in a lockdown environment where you can't tamper with the files, you can't delete them off. There's a complete trail of information about what's happening. You can set locks if you're taken to court. And so that's really great for these regulatory requirements, which goes beyond just data retention and says you've got to prove you haven't tampered with those files while you're retaining them.
So I think, listening to you talk about that, Tricia, archive as an English word kind of has two different potential meanings for me, right? One is a length of time. I need to take a snapshot of something and I need to keep it around. Usually it's long term, because when I think of archive, I think of something dusty, some old papers that have been sitting around for 10 years, right?
I think of the closing scene in Raiders of the Lost Ark. That
exactly.
giant government warehouse thing.
Exactly. And the other thing that could potentially be associated with archive is non-changeable, immutable in modern terms, right? That I not only have this snapshot, I'm not only keeping it for 20 years, but I want to make sure that what I have 20 years from now isn't changed from the original snapshot.
And a lot of the not changed is not only what type of media it's sitting on, but it's also keeping track of the records of who ingested it, who made changes, who updated policies, anything like that. So you have this change activity logs that go with
the
it.
audit, especially for legal holds and things like that, you need the audit trail and the chain of custody. So you know if it was altered in any way, it was by whom and when and under what circumstances, and have a very detailed record of that. Interestingly, in our litigious society, I guess it's not surprising that that's become super important. Almost in every industry, there's really specific requirements around, legal holds and retention periods, and also that chain of custody, making, metadata management more complicated, archive more complicated. So, we're on top of that and have been, because obviously as IBM, we service, all the Fortune 1000 and, every company in every industry worldwide. So we need to be acutely and keenly aware of all those requirements.
And this really goes back to our conversation at the beginning of the last month about classifying the data so you know what needs to be retained for this long periods of time. Okay, what I like about the retention sets is they're taking an already ingested backup, and then I can turn that into an archive without having to resend the data to Spectrum Protect. So that's really powerful because it gives you the data protection and the archive with a single ingest.
So we've had conversation, and I think it makes a lot of sense, right? You have archive for the purpose of long-term retention, and then you have archive for the purpose of meeting some sort of compliance and regulatory specification, including your own corporate governance. Some corporations want to hold themselves to a higher level of standard.
Sorry, and I think there's also a cost element too, right? So if you've got massive volumes of data, especially if they're media files or something like we talked about, archival also has a cost advantage, right? Because now you can put it on a medium that's much, much lower cost to sustain and retain over that long period of time. So it really is kind of a three-headed monster almost.
That's another kind of implied meaning of archive, right? I talked about it being old and dusty, right? And that implied meaning also comes down to, I'm really going to have not a lot of people looking at this simultaneously and not a lot of use. So I want to keep it very cost efficient because it's out there just in case for 20 years from now I ever need to see it, but I might not need to.
So there are two components to that, though, Sean and Randy, don't we think, right? So the first one is, right, hopefully that data isn't requested and used a lot, so we can put it on this cheaper medium of storage. And typically when we say cheaper medium of storage, it's do we say destination? It's further away from production. So getting that information back takes a little bit of time. How do we deal with the two things that seem to be very important? Number one is specific to that point. when regulators say you need to be able to produce a copy of your archive in X amount of time. And that time may be very quick, in which case some retention repositories might not suit what you're trying to accomplish. Is that true or not true?
Yeah. There are definitely, especially again in legal discovery, there are definitely retrieval SLAs that have to be met. So, to your point, if there's some litigation pending and they need to produce, within 24 hours, some detailed, item of some kind, some element of data, that's not always easy. If it's sitting in a tape cartridge in Iron Mountain, 3 states away, 24 hours seems like a long time, but it might not be.
I mean, this is what all lawyers argue about all the time, right? I mean, what do you mean by produce it? Is it in some format that you can search and actually find something on, or is it like 10,000 pages or gigabytes on one tape that I don't understand the format?
Is it like
I can't search it. I have no tools.
Or is it like in every movie about giant class action lawsuits where a truck pulls up with 1,000 file boxes in it and they unload them into the conference room? So
yeah.
And this once again goes back to data classification, because if when you are archiving or creating those retention sets or pushing that stuff into your Spectrum Protect for data retention and you're putting the tags on it that the product Spectrum Protect allows you to put on, then that's going to help you find the data. Now, whether or not you can retrieve it fast enough, like you said, if it's in the Iron Mountain or something, then that's the second question. So finding it and then physically being able to pull it off is the second piece.
I mean, a lot of this is also very industry specific, right? Like for instance, if you're selling securities as an example, right, or at least here in the United States, a lot of the transactions are recorded to a system that lets you go out there and put in a broker's name and just find all the transactions that are associated with that immediately. Because as a person who's working in that industry, the regulators are going to be there asking you for that information, right? Whereas some other systems and some other industries and some other types of data, maybe you don't know, right? So it's one of the things you kind of have to figure out as you go along.
So Sean, you brought up an interesting point. You said United States, and this kind of ties to the destination of where the data lives, right? So outside of North America, right, I have been made aware that in other countries, you can't have your archive live in certain places. So, for example, if your closest Amazon cloud, and let's say maybe you live in Germany, is in Austria, and I'm not saying that's what happens today, you can't store it outside of the borders of the country, right? And that plays as a very specific effect to where do you store the data? How could you possibly store the data? And does that storage allow me the cost-effective capabilities that other businesses may be able to achieve because they aren't held to such tight restrictions? Comments?
Exactly. There's a lot of GDPR has specific data sovereignty requirements in it, right? So you can't cross borders with certain PII, and that absolutely has a cost implication. I mean, you could argue that if I'm a provider in country, I can almost price fix because I don't have to sweat, lower cost competition coming from some international, competitor. If there's a hard requirement, right, it creates a less competitive marketplace, arguably. So it's an interesting consideration.
And I think the other thing to consider is if you do have data that's been backed up or archived and you've got to remove it because it's proven to be personal data that's not supposed to be out there or whatever, does your product allow you to go in there and extract that and delete it out of the backups and archives, which Spectrum Protect allows you, but it's definitely a concern.
So it seems like we've got a great set of solutions to be able to help clients kind of achieve all of their different requirements when it comes to data protection and data resilience, archive, and compliance, as well as our own IBM Garage that can help you architect a solution, kind of meet all of those requirements along your chain of custody that you might need data for. Tying into this, Sean, you found a really great, and this really has to do with cyber attacks, but it also ties into the conversation we were just having around in December, the United States got picked apart. Well, I'll let you describe it, right? But there was a major data breach at the end of last year. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, the data breach in the United States was basically from a company called SolarWinds, who does a lot of monitoring for a lot of government agencies. And that particular breach was about SolarWinds being breached and essentially distributing that backdoor to their United States government customers, right? So that's, I mean, almost, it's kind of funny. There are so many of these articles every day that's almost old news at this point, and it just happened a month ago. The thing that really struck me about the article I read about this subject was the same group that evidently orchestrated that SolarWinds based attack had also attacked Office 365 emails of the United States Treasury Department higher up officials. So they had gained access to those emails that were stored in an Office 365 environment. And the interesting thing about the attack that I read in this article was, if you hear a lot about these attacks, you often hear them being engineered through social engineering, through them gaining access to somebody's password or username and using that access to get access to the emails. And for this one, that wasn't how it happened. Evidently, these attackers, the same people who engineered this SolarWinds attack, were able to generate access tokens for Office 365 accounts and get into these Treasury Department people's emails. The reason I found that so interesting is because these days, when I think about, and when I talk to people, and when I think about cloud providers, I often think about them never losing data and being totally secure, right? Because these are the best of the best. These are the AWSs of the world, the IBMs of the world, the Microsofts of the world. And it turns out that their systems seem, at least based on this one example, seem to be just as vulnerable as any of the systems that are kept on premise, right? And that, I guess, that kind of threw me for a loop or changed my way of thinking about it a little bit.
Yeah, and it really just amplifies, and we've talked about it before, but it really just amplifies the risk vector, the attack vector. That's kind of like a covert attack, like it's not a direct frontal assault on some network or some, IT system, but it's kind of through a back door. So they exploited SolarWinds, which is a very widely used, monitoring and IT services application, as a way to kind of sneak into the monitored application portfolio, which was, the hackers and the state, especially state-sponsored agents and others who are well-funded and smart and clever, they're always going to figure out ways to exploit security. So once this happened, they're already off figuring out the next, way to sneak around, the guards and the measures that are in place to prevent cyber attacks and detection of cyber attacks. So it's a constant struggle. It's going to be a never-ending battle, which arguably is why things like, AI-driven security and penetration detection and things of that nature are so important, right? We've got to apply the most sophisticated, AI and machine learning and even, quantum computing in the future to detect these kind of assaults and attacks, because they're just getting more and more sophisticated and more covert. So
it also had me thinking about something really important so we've touched so far this year on data resilience. We've talked about data resilience for the cloud, and we've talked about this notion around compliance. And when I think about data resilience for the cloud, and we had the conversation about, I want to protect my applications that are born in the cloud. I want to protect my applications on-prem and move data to the cloud. A lot of folks would say Sean, to your point from before, right? My application is running in the cloud. Microsoft tells me they protect it. I don't know what that means, right? But to the layman, you might say, well, I have your data. So if something happens to this drive or this site, I have it because I utilize different technologies and capabilities, geodispersal, et cetera, to make sure I don't lose that information. That's not the same as compliance. And that's not the same as and with email, right, the journaling of data and having that data to be able to show it for compliant reasons. Plus, if I need to recover it at a certain point in time instantly, right, am I protected and am I prepared? So this kind of goes to, you really do need to protect your applications that are in the cloud, don't you?
I mean, to me, when I hear about people's justification for going to the cloud, right? A lot of times what I'll hear is, I don't want to worry about that anymore, right? To kind of summarize what you said, Steve, in a different way, right? I mean, all this stuff is so difficult. All this security is so difficult, and data protection is so difficult. And when I go to the cloud, those things are kind of taken care of for me by Microsoft and IBM and AWS and all the others. And to say what you just said in another way, I don't think that's true. I think you still have a considerable amount of things that you have to watch for, protect yourself against, be prepared for, just as if you had the data on your own premises.
Yeah, it's like it's almost a false sense of security, and that's a big part of the pitch for taking it to the cloud, Sean. You're right. It's you make a lot of baseline assumptions about protection and availability and recoverability that may or may not be valid, right? We talked about the Parler situation before. A prime example, the data was absolutely protected and available. The problem was it was a little too available to people who weren't necessarily supposed to have access to it. So you've got to balance sort of the ease of implementation and use that cloud provides, but also limiting, unrestricted access to some of the things that you need to protect. So it's definitely complicated.
Stood out for me in the article was the fact that a lot of these administrators, when you put stuff in the cloud or are using these cloud applications, is that administrator ID is also someone who owns that cloud, also has access, and that's to me a vulnerability, and is a reason really why you've got to be backing it up, because now you could have a bad actor accessing that data and directly through an administrative account.
So this brings up maybe the last topic. So let's say I'm leveraging a great technology like Spectrum Protect Plus. I'm backing up my Microsoft 365 application from the cloud. I still have to be able to recover this data, right? I mean, ultimately, when you have a loss, you need to recover. Either it's to keep the operation running, or you need to recover it for some sort of compliance reason. Someone needs access, right? Some sort of discovery. The question is, do you, the client, feel comfortable in how to do that, where to do that? If it's Microsoft 365 and that's where the loss was, do you feel comfortable going back there? How do I feel good about making sure I have those things in place to feel comfortable about using the cloud as I move forward into the future?
I think this has a lot to do with, once again, not putting all your eggs in one basket. So having both your application, your data, and your backup all on someone else's computers in that specific cloud, that to me becomes a big vulnerability. And so if you can replicate your backups to an on-site location or to a different location where everything is not sitting on the same platform.
Yeah, and there's an element of trust but verify too, right? I mean, you can accept the terms of service and presume those things are happening, but test, you've got to test and verify and do penetration testing and all those things that you may not want to do. You might want to take for granted, but it's the classic, and you guys know this better than I do, but it's the classic backing up data is easy, recovering it is hard. So if you don't know what your vulnerabilities are, or you don't test around the edges to figure out what those vulnerabilities might be in some repeatable kind of sophisticated way, then you can't necessarily make those baseline assumptions.
I'm glad you said that, Randy. We always talk about having a DR strategy is not a strategy if you don't test that strategy, continuously revamp the strategy and make sure that that recovery process works for you. And it's like any military team who practices and practices and practices and drills to make sure they get better and better and better at doing what they need to be able to do. With the data growth that's happening and the amount of time that is just shrinking between the need to be able to recover information, if you're not testing that process and feel good about the recovery steps and making sure you're meeting the business SLAs, you're never going to be able to do it. And I know it's not easy. And I think a lot of tools and technologies, you look at Spectrum CDM, you look at Spectrum Protect Plus, some of the automation set of capabilities that are put into those tools to be able to bring data back, have you look at it. It can bring it back in the middle of the night. You can set up a policy to do that. You can come in the morning, you can test it, you can look at it. Did it bring up my application properly? Okay, I feel good about that. And if not, let me change some of the processes. And the more I can automate it, even with things like Resiliency Orchestrator, company that our GTS, our global services team, bought, to be able to help a lot of the processes that happen in a disaster or a recovery scenario, help you bring those back better and stronger and faster, all help to make you a more robust business.
Yeah, and I think it just gets back to the whole, you've got to keep adapting because the threats are becoming more sophisticated and more numerous. It's going to be harder and harder to predict when they're likely to happen or how they're going to happen. So you just have to constantly be, thinking like the bad guys and, leveraging technologies and partners like you just described, right? So the good news, I guess, for our customers or hopefully our future customers is that IBM has a very, very broad and deep portfolio of capabilities in data protection and resilience, from the physical placement of data on a media device somewhere all the way out to the edge. So, and everything in between. Great.
Well, guys, I want to thank you very much. I thought this was a very interesting Spectrum cast, and I appreciate, Sean, that was a great find with the cyber attack, and I appreciate you bringing that up and having us talk about it, because I think it hits on all the capabilities we've been talking about so far on our Spectrum cast. So, gang, until next week, I appreciate it. Have a great day.
Thanks all.